school. He's a really neat guy. He was legally blind. He's an albino. He's a great guy. But he has a video game channel called like The Blind Gamer or something. And so legally blind doesn't necessarily mean no vision at all, right? Some people are blind and they have no vision. But in his case, he just has very, very, very weak vision. So like on his computers, he uses like the high contrast profiles and things like that. The funny thing is, he got a job as a video editor for a TV station. So he does like video editing, despite the fact that he's blind, which I just think is amazing. And he's amazing at his job. Like he does really cool work. So he reviews video games from like the perspective of a legally blind gamer, which I just think is really neat and impressive. Anyway, sorry?
You should check it right now.
I have no idea. But
I feel like the people that look at their stuff will love the stories you tell.
Probably. And then I probably feel like at some point in my life I will get like in horrible trouble for my completely inappropriate stories. Hi, Miss Sargent. I'm sure I've told you the story about a million times, but my student Kyle, who did like, they do like goodbye ceremonies for teachers at the end of the year at the assembly. So we were doing this at South Lincoln. It was my last year there, and I'd taught there for 6 years, so I knew these guys really well. And this kid Kyle, I had taught him like many, many times a year. I taught him all of his science classes, most of his math classes. So I taught this guy a lot. And he was a great kid. But he did like, we have a presentation, so they did, goodbye to so-and-so, and they gave them like a thing of flowers and whatever. And he goes, and now for Mr. Orlando, we put something a little special together. So they turned the lights off. And it was a video like supercut of me saying horribly inappropriate things. So the lights actually went down, and it started with just, in memoriam, Mr. Orlando. Like, first of all, that's for when you die, but okay. And it was like 2009 to 2016. And then the first thing here is, Kyle, I hope your dog runs away. And it proceeded to just be like 5 minutes of me saying really awful stuff. And it was, and like I'm standing next to my principal and like the superintendent of the, it was very awkward. And then the second half of it was, you can get those like YouTube where they like animate like your head on like a different video. So it was all the single ladies, and they had used like my voice, right? Like all the single ladies. And it was a lot of work to embarrass me in front of hundreds of people, right? Like this wasn't just a little bit of effort. This kid had really put the work in, and he was very proud of himself. And I at once thought it was very sweet, and also was horribly, horribly, horribly embarrassed. So anyway. And then I got a new job, and now I'm here at Eastvale. So now it's your turn. Congratulations, guys. You win the prize. I wonder if I would show it to you. I wonder if I still have it. I could email Kyle. I'm sure he does. Anyway, so yesterday and the day before, we talked about designing surveying in terms of who we ask. Does that make sense? And that's important. It's important to ask the right people. Because if we don't ask the right people, we can be biased, right? Today, we're also going to talk about other ways that we can be biased, because there's more that you have to worry about other than just whom you ask. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So to begin, we're going to talk for the rest of this unit about two different types of places we get information: primary sources and secondary sources. What do those words mean? Who's heard them before? Yeah.
It just means first and second.
You're right. So what's that mean? First-hand source, second-hand source. What's that mean?
Primary source, people actually collect the data, go out. Secondary source is taking the data that's already been.
Exactly. 100% correct. So this is data you collect yourself. All right. It could be surveys. It could be observations. It could be experiments, whatever. But this is data that you go out and you collect all by yourself. And obviously, if primary data is data that you collect yourself, then just like Chris has said, a secondary source is data that others have collected. What would be an example of a secondary source of information?
An article?
Yeah, a news article, textbook, would be secondary source. Sorry? Yeah, if you go on a website and get data, even good websites, like it's not just good or bad. If you went to Statistics Canada, where they have all of the statistics gathered from the Canadian Census and from all sorts of research trials, even that, you're looking up somebody else's data. That is secondary data. Does that make sense? Most data we use in life is secondary. And there's nothing wrong with that per se. It makes sense. If somebody else has already done the research you're looking for, does it make sense to necessarily go out and do it yourself? No. Now, I could teach a whole course on like how we use secondary sources. I've taken whole courses on how we use secondary sources, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. So I just want to say that we will talk a little bit more about secondary data tomorrow, because we're going to look some up for various things. But today I want to focus on doing your own research, just like we did over the last couple days. And like we've been talking about, we often use surveys to collect primary data. It's by no means the only way, but it's a big one we do use. We survey and we ask questions and we get data. Yesterday we talked about whom we survey, but today we're going to talk about designing the survey itself, which is really important. A good survey question helps us to find out the information we'd like to know. But a bad question can introduce anyone? What goes in the blank? What can a bad question introduce into your research?
Complication.
Complications is good, but I'm going to say bias. Though complications is a good answer. It means the same thing, but we're going to use the researchy word, which is bias. So with that in mind, let's imagine we wanted to do a survey of Eastdale students. It really doesn't matter. What do we want to ask students about? Let's make something up on the spot.
Favorite lunch.
Sorry?
Cafeteria.
Okay, so let's say we want to know about cafeteria food. Oh, okay.
Sorry, it's made for students. We don't need to. There's no the same food.
Listen, can I tell you something? I have found that the cafeteria food at Eastdale is made by students is superior to the cafeteria food at the other schools I've taught at, which were made by companies, which is not to say it's always perfect, but it's better than a lot of places I've been. Now, maybe there's things I don't know about that I don't want to know about behind the scenes. That's fine. Just don't tell me. Yeah, listen, I just don't want to. Here's what I like to think. I like to think how these kids work in my class, that can't be how they work in foods class. Surely they're dedicated and conscientious. And
I wouldn't say that.
anyway, okay. So I want to go through the different kinds of bias and how they can be problematic. And I'm just going to go with 3 major categories. There are more than this. All right, there's lots of different ways we can be biased. Thank you. The first is what we call a response bias. What do you think a response bias is?
When they respond.
When they respond. Okay, let's break that down. Okay, now specifically we want to talk about the way we've designed our question. So we're getting on the right track. So a response bias would be a question that...
Would it like have an answer in it almost?
Good. So it's a question that pushes people towards specific answers.
Garbage cafeteria.
So that could be an example. But so it is a question that, intentionally or otherwise, directs people to a certain answer. For example, you don't need to write this one. We're going to talk about our cafeteria thing. But if I said, does anyone see a problem with this question?
B.
B? B? Really? I don't think you mean that. I hope you don't mean that. The point being, joking aside, what if I did this?
Well, he's dead now.
Orlando, who doesn't teach math? Robinson or other? What's the problem with this question?
Other. You pick other.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. But the point being, what Robinson doesn't even teach math.
But he might be better.
Oh, trash talk.
One sec. Oh, God, there it is. Oh, there it is. And you know what it's covered in? No, all your mercs. They're just spilling all over the place, man. They're just gushing from what used to be your excellent grade in this course. Anyway, so, but even if we put joking aside, if there were 5 math teachers in the school and we put a survey out with 3 of their names and then other, is that a well-designed question? Are people more likely to pick other or more likely to, even though they know others there, maybe say, well, of the 3 names that are there, I really like Kelford. He'd be my choice, right? And so they circle that. So it could be a case where you give a list, but it doesn't have to be like that. It could also be like this. Ready? Question. Again, you don't have to write this. What do we think about that question? Oh, good Lord.
That was a very, very nice sound.
Isn't that lovely?
Yeah.
Okay, what do we think about this question? What do we think about this question? Studies have shown that high-fat foods are unhealthy. Should fries be served in the cafeteria? Okay, I mean, aside from yes or no, why is it a biased question?
Because, like, the information beforehand leads you to think that it shouldn't be because the high fat foods are so
Exactly.
you already have that in your mind when you're answering.
That's right. Yeah,
Also, not all fat foods are fans. So, like, what if they weren't deep fried?
exactly. And by the way, does every study show that high-fat foods are unhealthy? Interestingly, not. In fact, a lot of the modern research is showing that fats in proper proportion are not only not unhealthy, but are necessary. And that we have too few fats in our diet and too many grains and processed carbohydrates and sugars. So A, that information may be accurate, may be inaccurate, but certainly incomplete, right? Like health and nutrition is a big subject. We can't properly ram into one sentence, right? So we present some information that may be true or false, but may be misleading, right? And then we ask a question, right? If I said, 9 out of 10 people whose favorite sport is basketball is stupid. What's your favorite sport? Is that a fair question? Of course not, right? Does this make sense? So when we design a question, that promotes one response over another, it's bias. And the most dangerous thing you have to watch out for, the biggest danger is listing options, all right? Because even if you give people an option for other, what are they much more likely to pick? One of the things from the list, especially with no other. You know, especially if there's no other, but even if there is an other, you have to watch out for that. Now, does that mean we should never give people lists of options? I mean, sometimes that's just practical, right? Like if you're designing, say, a survey in Google Forms, you probably want to give the people a list of options so that's easy to tabulate how many people picked each thing, right? What should you try to do with that list? Yeah, make sure there's as many things on there as possible. As many things as people are likely to answer, you should put on there. What else? This is interesting.
Don't like hear people towards one or the other in the question.
Yeah, like do you know that on ballots, you know, like when you go to vote, does every ballot have the candidates listed in the same order? Do you know? I don't know how they do it in Ontario actually, but I know that in the United States, it's always randomized so that some people, you know, so it's not always the same person at the top of the ballot. Just in alphabetical order, at least in New York State, it's like that, because they know that when people don't really care, which one are they most likely just to pick? They're most likely just to pick the first one. So even the order in which you list them can be a type of response bias, right? When I make online quizzes for some classes, one of the options is randomize the order of the options, right? So that it's not always, you know, yeah, and even you have to watch, like, what if I accidentally, without realizing it, have made C the correct answer like 5 times in a row, even though I didn't mean to. Stuff like that can happen. But does that make sense? So a response bias is when, intentionally or not, we make a question that directs people to a certain answer. Okay. What's after that? What's after that? What's the next one?
Measurement bias.
Okay. What is measurement bias? Sorry, I've got to put my attendance in before I get in trouble. Who's missing today? Soraya's here. Soraya's over there.
Okay, that's a lot.
Yeah, I think, are they at volleyball, I wonder?
Yeah, Tristan and John are.
Tristan and John are at volleyball? Okay.
No, Amy. Not more. Did you just call me Dad? No. Amy, I said Dad. I didn't mean to call you Dad. I'm changing Dad. Actually, no, that's my dad's name.
Okay. Okay, a measurement bias. These are errors that skew results, often because of scale. Okay, so a measurement bias would be anything that skews your results, and often because of scale. Does that make sense? So the biggest one here is, you know how sometimes they put, like, on a scale of 1 to 10? Is it always immediately clear to people what 1 is and what 10 is? Right? Like, so if I said on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you hate cafeteria tacos? Do we even have tacos at the cafeteria here?
That would be awesome if we did.
I love tacos.
I think we had wraps at one point.
I like wraps. Wraps are good. Or pita day. Do they do have like pita day? Anyway,
They were terrible.
what's the problem with this question? What's the problem with this question?
You don't know if one, how, like, if you like it a lot or if you don't like it at all.
Yeah, especially because I put kind of weird language here, right? Like, how much do you hate? Is one I hate it? Or is one I don't hate it, so I love it? Do you know what I mean? So in this case, the numbers are unclear. So the danger would be this. The danger is that I put 10 because I really hate tacos. And Brody puts 10 because he really loves tacos. So to the person reading the survey, it looks like we have the exact same feeling. But in reality, we have opposite feelings. Does that make sense? So it's important to make sure that your measurement numbers and scales make sense. Now, there are other ways to have measurement bias. Oh, I'm sorry. There's other things that you would have to watch out for, but the biggest place this comes up with, people often do surveys where they want to say how many or things like that. That's counting. That's usually pretty easy. If I say how many pets do you have at home, probably that's easy to measure. But when we say on a scale of 1 to 10, it's important to make sure we say what 1 means, what 10 means. Does that make sense? And that our scale is set up well. But measurement bias really has to do with any time the numbers are skewed just because of the numbers themselves, making sure that the numbers all make sense. Even if I said, like, this would be a different example, but if I said how many people, how big is your family? And maybe some people would say 2, meaning there's 2 kids in their family. But other people with 2 kids in the family would say 4 because they mean mom, dad, 2 kids. Maybe somebody else would say 5 because they mean grandma, mom, dad, and 2 kids all live in the same house, right? Exactly. Does that make sense? Maybe they'd say how many other people live in the house, whereas you would answer including yourself. So anytime the numbers might be the problem, that's measurement bias. And we have to make questions where it's clear what we mean. So if I wanted to know how many people live in your house, I would say very clearly, including yourself, how many people live in your house. If I wanted to know how many siblings you had, I'd say, how many brothers or sisters do you have, not including yourself, right? Like just the siblings. But we want to be very specific. Otherwise, we get measurement bias. And lastly, what's this called? Non-response bias. Yeah, you can't respond, or maybe people just don't. This is when the question discourages some people from answering. All right, maybe their option isn't on the list. But it could be the tone of the question. Does that make sense? Like, it could be another one of these things where maybe it's like they're asking about like your favorite sport or something, but they use language that, you know, puts you off or makes you think that like what sport you're interested in doesn't matter, right? Maybe it would say something of like, of the big 4 sports, like football, hockey, soccer, this or that, which is your favorite? And you'd be like, well, I love sports, but not that one. So I'm just not going to answer this question. Does that make sense? Or maybe, so you have to watch out for the tone of the question. It could also be just it could be confusing language. I know that I've experienced this. Have you ever had to do one of these? And I feel like you always have to do this in some class where it's like, we're going to find out what color learner you are.
Oh.
That kind of thing. I should be careful saying this. But those things are awful, right? Does anyone else, like, I don't know, I hate them. Like, what color learner are you? Like, and I'm a blue. Or
yeah,
like,
but they have like actual names that someone actually.
Oh yeah. Or like you take like your personality test and you find out that you're like an E, S, D, Q, I don't know what.
And then that means that you're actually really dumb.
Yeah. So, and I hate these things, right? But the reason I hate them isn't that. It's that you read a question And it's always kind of weird, confusing language. And you're like, I don't even know what, I feel like I know myself pretty well. I spend all day, every day with myself, and I don't know the answer to this question. I don't know what it's asking me. And sometimes if we don't know what it's asking us, we may respond just by not answering. Does that make sense? So if you design a question that encourages some people to answer, but discourages other people to answering, that's where you run into the risk of non-response bias. Does that make sense? And in our cafeteria food, what would a question that could look like that look like? It could use really foodie specific language, right? Like maybe you ask a question that like asks people if they enjoy like the soups made with a mirepoix or without, right? And all the food students would be like, oh, I know what that means. That's like a mixture of carrots and onions and celery that's cooked in butter before you make a soup. And then all the kids who aren't food students are like, what the hell does that mean? So they just skip the question. Does that make sense? Or they just answer the question like BS, right? Like, oh, yes, I do. Does that make sense though? So if a question confuses people, or if it puts people off, or if it offends them, right? Right? If I was like, everybody knows that girls are stupid, what's your favorite this? You'd be like, screw you. Like, that's an awful question. I'm not answering it. That's a non-response bias. Does that make sense? Okay. So I do have some homework questions for this we want to do. We're going to spend tomorrow taking up, but now we're going to head down to the library. And here's what I want. I just want to lay this out for you so we're all on the same page. We are going to I will put back up, I promise. But before we do, we are going to head down and we are going to work on a surveying task. Now, guys, you're going to use the data you gather here a few times during this unit. Does that make sense? So you can work in pairs or alone. I don't care which. Either is fine. But here's what you need. You need 2 to 3 questions that are, listen, non-biased, carefully constructed, and I want their answers to be numerical, at least 2 of them. You can do more questions that if you want that don't have number answers. So if you want to do maybe 4 questions, but at least 2 have to have number answers. 2 at least must have numeric answers. So you could ask, how tall are you? You could ask how old, like about age. You could ask about things like that. But at least 2 of your questions have to have answers that are numbers. Okay? Then you're going to actually survey at least 30 people. All right? But I want you to have a target population and a good sample. Here's what I mean by that. Maybe you are interested in asking about boys who are at Eastdale, male students. Maybe your question specifically to male students. Your population then wouldn't be everyone at Eastdale. It would be the male population at Eastdale. That's fine. That's okay. Maybe your population is everybody at Eastdale, including staff, including support workers, including all that. That's fine. Maybe it's just students, whatever it is. But I want you to know exactly who your population is. So if your question is about everybody at Eastdale, then when it comes time to make a sample, you need to make sure that sample catches everybody, right? If your population includes teachers, you want to make sure that you survey some teachers, right? If your population is just males, then your sample should be just males. If your population is just students, then your sample should be students. But I want the best sampling you can. Does that make sense? So all that note we took yesterday about fair sampling, we want to think about that. So we're going to head down to the library now, and part of the reason we're heading to the library is this. Often, rather than just going around asking people out loud, it helps to make little survey sheets, right? Does this make sense? You could make up a page where you could put your question, circle your answer, question, circular answer, and that way you can hand them out to people and have them fill them out. Does that make sense? So you can do that if you want. Does anyone have a question what I mean by that? Is anyone not sure?
So we were going,
So we're going to go to the library right now.
no, well, are we going to the classes?
If you get to it today, yes. If not, you'll have time tomorrow.
No, where we're going there.
Shh. But does anyone have a question about what it is they're trying to do? So in the end, I want you to have 30 people's worth of data to at least 2 questions that have numbers. And if for interest's sake, you want to throw some more questions on there, that's fine. Before you actually go ask, I want you to tell me what your question is, what your questions are, and where you're going to go sample. So I have a sense so I can say, yeah, that's good, or no, I want you to think about that a bit more. Does that make sense? Any questions? Yes. And then, guys, down to the library, please. Once you've got this copy down, let's go. I feel like I forgot to click submit on my attendance after all that.